Can you guess whose Chinese name this is? It's pronounced Einstein. It's Einstein. Sounds similar enough, right? Einstein. In this video, we're going to look at how any foreign name can be transcribed into Chinese characters. Why don't we just take each letter of the name and translate it separately? With Russian, for example, that works pretty well. For each Latin letter, there exists a Cyrillic equivalent that sounds similar enough. Chinese, on the other hand, is not an alphabetic language, but rather a so-called logographic language, meaning that a character does not represent a given sound, but rather a specific meaning. For example, this character means love. Its pronunciation, I, is usually given by the pinyin system, so because Chinese doesn't have an alphabet, foreign names usually can't be transcribed one-to-one. Another option would be to just use the foreign name directly, without any translation or transcription, and this does actually happen sometimes in newspaper articles or on Wikipedia pages, especially when it comes to names of companies or technologies. Words like AI, Temu, TikTok, Android, or Google are just inserted into Chinese text as is. In online forums or chats, this is even more commonly seen. But in general, Chinese language planners often rush to find Chinese equivalents for trending foreign terms, because for one, it doesn't look very nice to mix these radically different scripts. But more importantly, some Chinese people might struggle pronouncing these foreign words, especially in rural areas where there are still lots of people that are not familiar with the English language. That's why Google, for example, is also commonly referred to by these two characters, which every Chinese person will know are pronounced gu ge, which comes decently close to Google. If the name has a clear meaning associated with it, there is the option to just translate it literally. For example, the pirate called Blackbeard is simply called Hei Huzi in Chinese. Microsoft just becomes Wei Ran, meaning tiny and soft. Or Valentine's Day, where the reference to Saint Valentine is just dropped in favor of a more descriptive name, Qing Ren Jie, which means lover's holiday. But for most names, this isn't an option because, well, it's just a name without an obvious meaning to it. If we want to find a fitting Chinese version for those, we usually just try to approximate the sound of the original name, which is what transcription does. But before we look at how to systematically transcribe names into Chinese, it is worth noting that for some languages it is more straightforward than for others. Take this word, for example. It's pronounced tiramisu. Any idea what this could refer to? It's of course the famous Italian dessert, tiramisu. The reason why Italian words are often very convenient to transcribe into Chinese is because they flow very nicely thanks to the many vowels and lack of consonant clusters. In some other languages, it's way more common for lots of consonants to be stacked next to one another, for example the Polish name Krzysztof, or even certain English words like strengths. You can imagine that it's quite a bit harder to find a Chinese sound-alike for these. It turns out that there just aren't very many different syllables in Chinese. Chinese syllables start with an optional consonant, followed by one or more vowels, and they may end in an in or ng sound. No other consonant endings exist, with the exception of the r character. In total, the number of syllables is just over 400. That's excluding the 4 to 5 tones that each of these syllables could have, because they don't influence how words are transcribed. As you can see, there are quite a few empty cells in the table, meaning that there are lots of syllables that could technically be said, but just don't have any characters that are pronounced this way. If you want to know more about this, there's a great video I have linked below. The reason the ra in tiramisu ends up becoming la is because there just isn't any Chinese character pronounced ra, and la is the closest sounding thing. Transcribed words like this could be one of the reasons why Chinese people often mix up L and R when speaking foreign languages. So how do we know which of these syllables we should use when transcribing a name? Basically, the answer is this monstrosity. It tells you for each initial consonant and final vowel sound which Chinese syllable comes closest to that sound. This is an official transcription table published in 1993 by Xinhua in a book called Names of the World's Peoples. This massive reference work contains transcription tables for more than 60 languages. Despite the title, the tables are not solely used to transcribe names of people, but also names of objects, for example companies or dishes and so on. They also often include a separate table used for transcribing place names, which at times use slightly different characters. In this video, we will focus on the English version of the table. You might have noticed that there are some funny-looking characters in the headers that don't look like regular English. That has to do with a slight problem with the English language, which is that the way a word is written does not always tell you how it is pronounced. This expression, for example, sounds different depending on if it occurs in though, through, tough, cough, thought, or drought. Most other languages featured in this book do not suffer from this issue, so the tables can just be constructed using the regular letters. To solve this issue, the writers labeled the English table using the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, where each letter stands for a specific sound. IPA tells you exactly how a word is pronounced. In case you don't know it by heart, here's a very quick overview. Most consonants are the same as in regular English, but for some sounds a designated letter is introduced. Similarly for vowels, although here there is sometimes a distinction based on whether it's a short or a long sound. But for our purposes that really doesn't matter because it ends up being grouped to the same row of the transcription table anyway. Let's go through some examples of how to use this table to transcribe names. For example, Max in phonetic is written like this. Then we go through the word, each time taking as many letters as the table allows. The first syllable has initial M and final E, which becomes ma. Then we have just the K as initial with an empty final as there is no vowel to use, so this becomes the K character. And similarly, the S becomes S. So the name Max in Chinese is Ma Ke Si. Even though it went from one syllable to three, it sounds pretty similar if you say it quickly enough. Ma Ke Si. Fun fact, if we do the same thing for the name Musk, we end up with Ma Si Ke, since the table doesn't distinguish between the A and sounds. So these two transcriptions are almost the same, only the last two characters are swapped. You might have noticed that some cells in this table are empty because there is no single character which is suitable enough. In this case, the original syllable just has to be broken up further. Sometimes a syllable is transcribed using multiple characters, although if you look at gu eng, the cell might as well have been left empty because we get to the same result of gu and eng by just breaking up the syllable. Let's go through another example. The transcription for Taylor comes out as Tai Le Er, Tai Le Er, and her last name, Swift, becomes Si Wei Fu Te, Si Wei Fu Te, and that's how you can transcribe pretty much any name into Chinese. You have probably noticed that a few of the cells contain an asterisk. These are syllables that use a different character when transcribing a female first name, although the pronunciation is pretty much the same apart from the tone. In these edge cases, instead of using the default characters, we occasionally use different characters which have some female connotation to them, often marked by one of these three radicals. Because this table is set up using the IPA, you can use it for way more than just English names. It only fails if the name contains a sound that is not present in the English language, as we will see in the following example. This is the famous Polish-born physicist and chemist best known for developing the theory of radioactivity, known by her French name Marie Curie. Her name is transcribed as Ma-Li, but wait, it actually isn't, because we're talking about a female first name here, and since these cells contain an asterisk, there are special characters to use in this case, which means her actual Chinese name is Ma Li. Her last name, Curie, contains the Ü sound, which exists in lots of languages, for example as this umlaut in German. However, it does not exist in English, which is why the corresponding IPA letter, which looks like a Y, is not even listed. The sound does exist in Chinese though, for example in ju, and so in this case it would be better to use a different transcription table, for example the French one, to arrive at ju li. So her full Chinese name is Ma Li Ju Li. So now that you know the official method to transcribe any name into Chinese, let's talk about some exceptions. The Chinese name we determined for Taylor Swift is almost correct. It's just that the R is dropped, so Taylor becomes Tai Le. This version arguably sounds closer to the original because they now both have 2 syllables. Something interesting mentioned in the Wikipedia article is that she's also called by a shorter form of her name, which is just Tai Le Si. This is, however, not to be confused with Tai Le Si, which, fun fact, is the name of Greek philosopher Thales, whom you might know from his famous theorem about right-angled triangles inscribed in semicircles. The names sound exactly the same, and the S in Thales is actually the same one used in the long form of Taylor Swift's name, which just seems like it could easily be a cause for confusion. A common reason why names don't always follow the transcription scheme is because of historical usage. Take John, for example. From the table, you would expect the Chinese version to be Jia Eng, but no. Rather, John is actually transcribed the same way as its older German version Johann, whose Chinese version of Yuhan was already widely used. There can also be regional differences in the transcriptions, as we can see by the name Trump. In mainland China, he is called Telang Pu, which is just what you get when following the official transcription table. However, in other Chinese-speaking regions like Hong Kong and Taiwan, they often use different transcription guidelines than the one by Xinhua. In those parts, Trump is called Chuang Pu instead. At this point, I would like to point out that the transcription tables are not perfect. For example, there are quite a few Chinese syllables that don't even appear in the table and are thus never used in any transcription, like these ones, for example. But it's clear that the writers could not handle every single edge case without the table getting even more enormous and just practically unusable. But in theory, they could have included an initial for sui in order to make use of these 3 syllables, sui, suo, and suang, and it would have actually been quite handy in one of our examples, where sui could have been grouped together to form sui fu te instead of si wei fu te, basically saving 1 syllable. Having all foreign names be transcribed with the same set of characters that you see on this table comes with upsides and downsides. The upside is that they are official, at least in mainland China, and when reading one of these characters you can be fairly sure that you're reading part of a name, because many of these characters aren't used in modern-day speech, and so pretty much only occur in transcribed terms. A weakness of this purely phonetic approach is that the meaning of the transcribed name ends up being pretty random. For example, 爱因斯坦 literally means love reason this flat. Also, if all translated names always just use these same bunch of characters, it feels like it would be wasting the richness of the Chinese language. That's why sometimes people keep the syllables of the transcription the same, but choose other characters for their name, often ones with a positive connotation or ones that describe them well. Mercedes-Benz, for example, is called 奔驰 in Chinese, which literally means to speed or to gallop. Or IKEA, which is called 宜家, meaning suitable and home. But how to find a suitable character for a given syllable? For example, for the sui that I suggested could be used earlier. One approach would be to go on a website like writtenchinese.com and just looking at a list of all characters with that sound. Most of them will be somewhat neutral in meaning, but there's definitely some that you might want to avoid, like this sui, which means evil spirit, or this sui, which read differently means urine. But often you'll find something positive like this sui, which means to satisfy or to succeed. This way, your name not only sounds similar to the original, it can even reflect your personality. That's it for this video. I hope you learned something new. So what's your name in Chinese? Or maybe a friend's name if you don't want to talk to yourself. I would love to hear it in the comments. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.